40% of people who are experiencing grief, all types of grief, not even the intense grief of losing a child or a spouse, that 40% of them in the first 3 months meet criteria for major depressive disorder. Is depression normal in grief? It's a big question. Oftentimes we talk about depressed mood being normal when we're grieving. Yet we live in a culture where it's hard to adequately express depressed mood in functioning activities. Hopefully you have close friends that you can share those kind of intimate thoughts with. But depressed mood should not be confused with major depressive disorder. So unfortunately, I happen to be an expert in grief, not just because of the credentials that I have, but because I have lost so much and I have experienced every type of grief, from the sudden loss of a child to anticipatory grief of losing my husband in hospice, to going through medical trauma with one of my sons that ultimately ended in his life. And in the process of all of that, that was over 20 years, I've lost 3 children and my husband over the course of 20 years. And grief comes in all forms. Grief, when my son was diagnosed with DRPLA, a rare neurodegenerative condition, I had to grieve the loss of a normal child. Then as he began to get sick, I had to grieve the loss of ability, grieve limitations, grieve that he'll probably never marry, grieve that he won't grow up and be normal. And so in the process of these big losses, I have had to grieve the little things along the way. And so, yes, I'm an expert in grief. And yes, I have struggled with depression. So when is depression normal? And when is it clinically significant? When should you seek care? When should you do something about it? Well, my first challenge to you is all depressed mood needs to be worked through. So whether it is normal, mild, and you are just sad for what is going on in your life, you need to feel that in order to heal. But let's talk about what is major depressive disorder. Major depressive disorder is a clinically significant depression that may need professional intervention or at least some internal work on that depression. Like you actually bring it to the surface and work through it. So to meet the criteria for major depressive disorder, there has to be a significant impairment in function. And I know many of you that watch my videos have lost a child, and there is impairment in function. And you likely meet criteria for clinical depression. So let's talk about that. When it's clinical depression, major depressive disorder is more than just a depressed mood. It involves, and you have to have at least 5 of these things: a loss of pleasure, an increase or decrease in weight or appetite, an increase in or decrease in your ability to sleep, an increase or decrease in your physical, we call it psychomotor, either agitation or catatonia, like you're just not doing anything, or you're very, very agitated. Fatigue is one of those signs of major depressive disorder. Feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, worthlessness, and guilt. How many of my moms and dads out there who have lost a child have had those feelings? Not to judge, right? The question this video is to answer: is depression normal in grief? The answer is yes and no. Yes, depressed mood is normal, and losing a child has to be the hardest grief to work through. But when it goes into clinical depression, then it's not quote unquote normal. Like, what is normal anyway? When we're dealing with and processing the loss of a child, nothing is normal. Okay. So is grief normal? Yes, I want you to feel the pain. You have to feel in order to heal. But that pain sometimes is so heavy. I talk about grief being physically heavy. that it can cause clinical depression. I looked up some research about this. 40% of people who are experiencing grief, all types of grief, not even the intense grief of losing a child or a spouse, that 40% of them in the first 3 months meet criteria for major depressive disorder. Now, thankfully, over time, that decreases to, at 1 year, about 17% of mostly widows in this study. They didn't study people who have lost a child, still meet criteria for major depressive disorder. So that was not even specifically around losing a child. That is major losses, including losing your spouse. At 1 year, 17% still met criteria for major depressive disorder. And then we've talked about in other videos, prolonged grief disorder. But there was this other study that resonated with me very deeply, that they studied specifically people who have lost a child. And they didn't look specifically at major depressive disorder criteria. They asked the question of whether they felt a mental health decline. You can imagine that number is pretty high. And this is even years later, 3 to 5 years after losing a child. 71% of mothers felt a mental health decline, and 66% of fathers felt a mental health decline. And I can tell you from my clinical and personal experience, I am definitely in that 71%. I, like many young girls in Western cultures, struggled with depression before I really even had a reason to be depressed. I had some signs of depression as a teenager, as a young adult. And when I lost my first son in 2005 in a drowning accident, I went into fight or flight. I didn't experience true depression. I had, at the time, 7 children. I lost 1. I had 6 children to continue raising. My son started having seizures, and I was just in this fight or flight, like I've got to fight for my family. I didn't take the time to feel the pain of losing Johnny. And so I didn't start really understanding grief and depression until I lost my daughter in 2021. And in the midst of that, it was 10 years of medical trauma, and then I lost Reggie. Now, I'm not saying I didn't feel depressed mood. I did after losing Reggie. There's so much around the grief and loss of a child that I can't see how it doesn't cause depression. One of the fights that I used to have with my husband, beautiful man, wonderful character, never really struggled with depression. And so here he had the same disorder that we were losing our children to. And I would fight with him like, how can you not be depressed? And I think in a lot of relationships, the way we grieve differently, and I know my husband loves his children, but I felt deep, deep sadness and depression around losing my children. First it was Reggie, and then Maya suddenly. Like Reggie, like I said, there was 10 years of medical trauma. When I lost Maya, it was so unexpected and so painful. And it wasn't until 9 months later, 9 months after her death, that the depression hit me hard. And now it's about 2.5, almost 3 years after her passing, and I still struggle with some depression. My husband passed 3.5 months ago, so it's like this cumulative loss. And I'm doing the work. Follow me, watch the videos. I am doing the work of feeling the pain. But sometimes we think it's like this little, feel the pain and it'll go away. It may never go away, but I can tell you that I do find joy. I do find purpose. And that's each one of these videos. I want to give you something that you can work towards. Sorry. That's my story. What's your story? How is depression impacting your life? How is your grief impacting your depression? I have whole playlists on, grief and how to organize that. And it's more than just grieving the loss that you are experiencing. It's the impact that it has on your anxiety, on your negative self-talk, on the things that were there before your loss, the circumstances around death that just get all disorganized in the brain and contribute to depression. So what can you do about it? That same research study that said 71% of mothers and 66% of fathers felt a mental health decline showed that there were certain things that indicated that someone was doing better than others. So everyone is feeling this pain of their loss. They talked about two things. If they had activities with purpose and activities with connection. And I'm going to add three things. I'm going to say there's three things that we need to be focusing on. Purpose. This is hard for some people. And for me, I went big. I'm like, I have got to find purpose in this on a bigger scale. There's nothing out there that helps people who are grieving the loss of a child, or at least I couldn't find it at that time. And so I wanted to write books and do videos, and I wanted this big purpose. But sometimes that adds a different layer of stress, and that is not for everyone. My ability to be open and vulnerable publicly is not for everyone. But finding your purpose, there is a reason that you're living and that you should choose life, because depression can actually cause suicidal thoughts. So choosing life, choosing to find the purpose, even if it's small, grandchildren to have relationships with, or I don't know your life, but finding some purpose and then finding connection. Sometimes that's really hard. We feel like nobody understands our pain, and so we separate a little bit. And I know I have people who love me, but I have a hard time showing them the depth of the pain that I'm experiencing. So sometimes getting into a grief group where people have experienced similar loss can help. But my challenge is those close connections that you've had that have been with you throughout your life, make a conscious effort to maintain those. And then the third I would say is your health. When I say choose life, grief, especially intense grief, will take a physical toll on your body. If you watch my grief documentary, I went and I did all of these assessments, and my body is physically reacting to the pain of grief. And I am addressing that in using neurofeedback, using counseling, and following up on all of those medical things. So we have to treat our body as both a mental, physical, and spiritual health. And this, again, is something that we often neglect to talk about professionally. But we can't talk about grief without talking about spiritual health. Knowing that our spirit, our soul is eternal, there is something bigger. And I'm not saying, many people are like, I don't believe in God, shut her down, I don't want to listen to her anymore. If you have lost a child, I want you to try to make that spiritual connection. You are a spiritual being. It's not about proselytizing a certain belief system. It's about your spiritual health. So my challenge to you is watch the video on spiritual self, continue to watch through some of the other playlists that I have around grief. There's a lot of good content here. You can give us your information and get content on a regular basis and just be a part of this community. I do believe that you are mentally strong, that you can find your purpose. And I want you to know that I'm still on this journey, and we're on this journey together.